In the middle of the most glittering gala the city had seen in years, Sloan Whitmore walked to the center of the stage, slid the engagement ring from her finger and pressed it into the calloused palm of Nolan Avery, in front of hundreds of watching eyes. The room laughed softly when she called him a beautiful but cheap mistake. Nolan said nothing in return. He simply closed his hand around the ring, looked at it one last time, and turned toward the board of directors seated near the front. 10 minutes later, every screen in the grand hall lit up with a single line that made Sloan go pale where she stood, a line announcing the new controlling owner of Whitmore Dynamics, a name nobody in that room expected to see, the name Nolan Avery. If you enjoy stories with a twist cold enough to freeze a boardroom, press subscribe now so you never miss how expensive that ending becomes. The ballroom of the Ashford Regency had been transformed for the 70th anniversary of Whitmore Dynamics, crystal chandeliers throwing long shadows across marble floors, while photographers lined the entrance and investors mingled beneath banners bearing the family crest. Every network affiliate in the tri-state area had sent a crew. Every hedge fund manager who mattered had accepted an invitation, and the air itself seemed to hum with old money and older expectations. Sloan Whitmore arrived like the reigning queen of the evening, dressed in unbroken black, flanked on one side by her father Sterling Whitmore, and on the other by a rising financier named Pierce Harrington III. Nolan Avery arrived late and unremarkable, wearing a suit that had clearly been pressed with care but had also clearly seen many years of service. A few guests recognized him as the contractor who had quietly repaired the cooling systems at a Whitmore manufacturing plant months earlier, and they whispered among themselves that a man like that did not belong in a room like this. Sloan had been secretly engaged to Nolan since the period when he helped her company survive a mechanical crisis that no one else could solve, but the pressure from her father, from the board, and from a looming merger with Harrington Capital had convinced her the relationship needed to end, publicly and decisively. On stage, Sterling spoke first, weaving a speech about legacy, standards, and the courage to make the right choice for the family name. When he finished, he invited his daughter to the microphone, and Sloan stepped forward with a visible tremor beneath her composed exterior. She called Nolan up in front of the crowd, and when he arrived, she removed the ring and placed it in his hand, telling him that whatever had grown between them had been a mistake, that he was a decent man but simply did not belong in her world. The line that cut the deepest was the one she delivered with the coldest control in her voice, telling him she could not allow pity to be mistaken for a marriage. Laughter rippled through the hall in polite, cruel little waves, and Pierce Harrington smiled with visible satisfaction, while Sloan's cousin Grant Whitmore began the applause that others quickly joined out of habit rather than agreement. Nolan did not raise his voice or argue his case. He looked down at the ring resting in his palm, an old silver band that had belonged to his family for generations rather than some flashy diamond purchased to impress, its interior engraved with a line his father had chosen decades earlier that read "Return only what was never yours." As security began moving toward him at Sterling's quiet signal, Nolan spoke just loudly enough for Sloan to hear him over the murmuring crowd, telling her that she had just returned the only thing he truly wanted to keep, which meant it was perhaps time he collected everything else that belonged to him. Months before that humiliating night, Nolan had been living a quiet life in a small town in New Jersey, running a modest operation called Avery Precision Repair, fixing industrial machinery and complex mechanical systems for local manufacturers. To most people, he appeared to be an ordinary tradesman, but in an earlier chapter of his life, he had been a core systems engineer responsible for some of the most advanced energy stabilization designs in the industry. He had a young daughter named June, who appeared only briefly in his life story, but represented the entire reason he had chosen a quiet, guarded existence. having lost his wife to illness years earlier and having decided afterward that peace mattered more than recognition. Whitmore Dynamics had been facing a severe crisis at one of its industrial engine plants, where a critical cooling system kept overheating and threatened a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The company's senior engineering team had spent weeks trying to solve the failure without success, until a plant manager who trusted results over pedigree recommended calling Nolan. Sloan had been skeptical at first, unwilling to believe that a small independent contractor could accomplish what an entire department of specialists could not. But Nolan needed only a few hours to trace the fault back to a flaw buried in the original design. A flaw connected to an old patent that Whitmore had acquired under circumstances nobody wanted examined too closely. Sloan found herself drawn to his composure and his intelligence in a way she had not expected. Nolan never asked for an inflated fee, requesting instead that the company review its old technical records and ensure that the plant workers were not blamed for a defect that predated all of them. That request, so different from anything she had encountered in a boardroom, began to change how she saw him, and the connection between them grew slowly through conversations that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with honesty. What Sloan did not know was that Nolan carried a far larger secret, one involving inheritance rather than romance. He was the rightful heir to a foundational set of patents that Whitmore Dynamics had relied upon for years, and through a quiet investment vehicle called Harbor Vale Holdings, he had also spent recent years acquiring convertible debt and preferred shares the company had sold off during an earlier financial crisis. Late one evening, alone in his workshop, Nolan opened an old safe and looked over documents that placed his name beside a single decisive figure, a clause granting him 54% of voting control the moment Whitmore Dynamics breached the original patent agreement. The workshop itself told its own quiet story to anyone who bothered to look closely. Shelves lined with worn textbooks on thermal engineering, a drafting table covered in sketches that predated the current generation of Whitmore engines by more than a decade, and a small framed photograph of a younger Nolan standing beside his father in front of a plant that no longer existed under that name. Nolan had grown up watching Graham Avery work long nights solving problems nobody else in the industry could touch, and he had learned early that the men who built things rarely received the credit given to the men who sold them. That lesson had shaped every decision he made once he inherited both his father's mind for engineering and his father's unfinished business with the Whitmore family. He had never set out to acquire a company. His original goal had simply been to recover what his father was owed, a modest correction rather than a takeover. And for years he pursued that goal through ordinary channels, filing requests for records, writing letters that went unanswered, and hiring accountants to trace where the old royalty payments had quietly stopped appearing. Only when he discovered that Whitmore Dynamics was preparing to erase the last trace of the Avery patents through a merger designed to move the technology overseas did he realize that quiet correction would never be enough, and that protecting his father's legacy would require something closer to full control. Even then, Nolan moved with deliberate restraint rather than aggression, buying distressed debts slowly through Harbor Vale Holdings so that no single transaction would draw attention, and structuring the acquisition so that his ownership stake would remain dormant unless a specific trigger occurred. He wanted the power to protect what mattered, not the burden of running a corporation he had never asked to inherit, and that distinction would matter enormously in the weeks ahead, separating him in the eyes of everyone who eventually learned the truth from an ordinary corporate raider chasing profit. Sloan held the title of chief executive, yet, in practice, she operated under constant siege from her own family and the board that surrounded her. Sterling never let her forget that Whitmore Dynamics was not simply a company, but the bloodline of the Whitmore name itself, and he made it clear he would not accept his daughter falling for a single father with no status and no pedigree. Pierce Harrington III had been presented to her as the obvious solution, wealthy, polished, connected to a powerful investment fund willing to rescue Whitmore from a quietly worsening debt crisis, though the unspoken condition of that rescue was that Sloan sever ties with Nolan and align herself fully with the Harrington family. Grant Whitmore, her cousin and fellow board member, spent weeks planting doubt in her mind, insisting that Nolan had only approached her for money. He produced photographs of Nolan entering a law office, copies of old shareholder records, and fragments of transactions tied to Harbor Vale Holdings, all carefully arranged to suggest deception. What Grant conveniently omitted was the far more important truth, that Nolan was not extracting wealth from Whitmore Dynamics at all, but rather that Whitmore Dynamics owed a debt to Nolan that had never been properly settled. Sterling gave his daughter an ultimatum, telling her that unless she publicly ended things with Nolan, the board would vote to remove her from leadership and hand control of the merger entirely to Pierce. Sloan, wounded but still proud, never confronted Nolan directly about any of it, convincing herself that if he were truly innocent, he would have explained everything before she had to ask. His silence, born of a wish to protect her rather than manipulate her, became the very evidence she used to condemn him in her own mind. Sterling arranged for private dinners where Pierce would casually mention numbers, quarterly projections, and expansion plans that made Whitmore Dynamics sound like it was standing on solid ground, when in truth the company's balance sheet had been quietly deteriorating for 2 years under decisions Sterling himself had approved. He wanted Sloan distracted by the comfort of Pierce's confidence, hoping she would never look too closely at the debt structure that Nolan had already begun to understand better than anyone inside the company itself. Every dinner, every toast, every carefully rehearsed compliment about family legacy was designed to keep Sloan inside a version of reality that served her father's interests rather than her own judgment. Grant played a different role, positioning himself as the concerned cousin who only wanted to protect Sloan from being taken advantage of, while privately negotiating his own arrangement with Harrington Capital that promised him a significant commission once the merger closed. He timed his warnings carefully, always delivering them in private moments when Sloan was already exhausted from board pressure, making his fabricated evidence land with more weight than it deserved. Grant understood that the easiest way to manipulate someone confident and intelligent was not through obvious lies, but through a slow accumulation of half-truths mixed with just enough real detail to seem credible. Sloan, for all her intelligence, had been raised inside a family culture that equated love with obligation and loyalty with silence, and that upbringing made her more vulnerable to her father's pressure than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. She wanted to trust her own instincts about Nolan, yet every conversation with Sterling chipped away at her confidence, reframing her feelings as naivety and her judgment as inexperience. By the time the gala arrived, she had convinced herself that ending things publicly was not a betrayal of Nolan, but a necessary sacrifice to save the company and honor a family legacy she had never been allowed to question. Meanwhile, Nolan understood exactly what the board intended, that they were preparing to sell Whitmore Dynamics into a merger that would gut its workforce and dissolve its independence. He had not yet triggered his ownership rights because he did not want to destroy something Sloan clearly loved, holding out hope that she would eventually see for herself who around her was loyal and who was simply circling for profit. Sterling handed his daughter a prepared speech for the anniversary gala, one that included a line declaring she had ended a personal relationship unsuited to the future of Whitmore, and Sloan stared at the ring on her hand for a long, uncertain moment before folding the speech and setting it aside. though in the end she still carried the ring with her that night. Back in the present moment of the gala, after Sloan returned the ring, Nolan became the target of open mockery among the city's elite. Pierce approached with practiced courtesy, laced with contempt, suggesting that Nolan should feel grateful merely to have been invited into such company at all. Grant loudly remarked that a repairman could not simply talk his way into the Whitmore family through a few charming words, while Sterling coldly instructed security to escort Mr. Avery out before he ruined the dignity of the evening any further. Nolan did not raise his voice, did not cause a scene, and did not beg Sloan to reconsider in front of the crowd. That composure unsettled Sloan more than any outburst could have, because some part of her had hoped he would fight, hoped he would prove her wrong. Yet instead he only looked at her with something closer to disappointment than pain. As the security detail closed in, Nolan lifted his phone and called his attorney, Mara Ellison, speaking only a few words into it, instructing her to activate the Whitmore clause and make the full voting record public. Mara asked him to confirm once, and Nolan glanced toward the stage where Sterling was raising a celebratory glass beside Pierce before answering that they had already returned the ring, so now it was time to return the company. In the control room behind the ballroom, the technical staff received an unexpected legal directive from attorneys representing the controlling shareholder group, and every display screen in the venue switched over to an emergency notice. Guests initially assumed it was some promotional preview tied to the Harrington merger, and Pierce even stepped forward with confidence to address the crowd, until the words appearing on the screens froze him in place. The notice announced a change in controlling ownership of Whitmore Dynamics, naming Harbor Vale Holdings as the entity holding majority voting rights, with Nolan James Avery listed as its representative owner. A silence fell over the entire hall, thick enough to hear individual breaths. Sloan turned toward Nolan so fast her heel nearly slipped beneath her. Sterling's champagne glass slid from his fingers and shattered against the marble, and Grant's face drained of color because he understood exactly what this meant for the secret he had spent months trying to bury. Nolan walked slowly toward the stage, ignoring the murmuring crowd entirely, and keeping his eyes fixed only on Sloan, telling her that she had returned his ring in front of everyone, so he supposed it was only fair that he return the truth in front of everyone as well. He did not raise his voice or gloat as he spoke. Instead, he allowed Mara Ellison to appear by video with the full legal record, and she began walking the room through a history that predated most of the people standing in it. Years earlier, when Whitmore Dynamics stood on the edge of bankruptcy for lacking the core technology needed for its new generation of efficient engines, an engineer named Graham Avery had designed the thermal stabilization system that saved the company from collapse. In gratitude, the Whitmore family of that era had signed an agreement promising profit sharing and protective equity tied to that patent. But after Graham's death, Sterling Whitmore and a group of executives quietly buried the agreement, paying only a token settlement while continuing to use the Avery technology as though it belonged entirely to the company. Nolan had been young at the time, caring for a wife whose illness demanded everything he had, and he lacked the resources to fight a legal battle against a corporation with unlimited lawyers. His silence in those years was never weakness, only patience as he quietly gathered every document, every signature, and every piece of correspondence he would eventually need. When Whitmore later fell into a debt crisis and its creditors began selling off convertible bonds at a steep discount, Nolan used Harbor Vale Holdings to acquire that debt piece by piece, combining it with his patent-linked equity to hold the power to trigger majority control the instant Whitmore violated the agreement or attempted to sell assets connected to the Avery technology. The merger with Harrington Capital was precisely that violation, the very trigger Nolan had waited years to see. Sloan stood frozen as she realized Nolan could have destroyed Whitmore Dynamics at any point over the past several months, yet had chosen not to, quietly protecting the company instead so she could keep her seat and lead it honestly, saying nothing because he wanted her to earn her position through genuine ability rather than lean on the power he held behind the scenes. Sterling tried to dismiss the claim, calling Nolan an opportunist chasing a payday, but Mara immediately produced his own signature on an old supplementary contract that confirmed everything. Grant insisted the documents were fabricated, only for Mara to display internal emails, proving he had known the full truth for months while still pushing to sell the company to Harrington in exchange for a private commission promised to him personally. Pierce, sensing the collapse of the deal, tried to distance himself by claiming Harrington Capital was merely an outside investor uninvolved in internal matters, until Nolan produced additional records showing Pierce's team had already drafted plans to break Whitmore Dynamics into pieces, eliminate thousands of jobs, and sell the Avery patents overseas for a quick profit. The atmosphere of the gala shifted entirely within minutes. People who had laughed at Nolan only moments earlier now avoided meeting his eyes, and Nolan closed the moment with a line delivered in a level, almost tired voice, telling Sloan that he had not purchased her company, only reclaimed the portion her family had wrongfully held for 20 years. Following that public unraveling, Sloan retreated to a private room behind the main hall, and rather than dissolving into loud tears, she simply sat in stunned silence, having believed for years that she controlled her own life, only to discover her father, her cousin, and her fiancé-to-be had all been quietly maneuvering around her. Nolan followed but kept a careful distance, refusing to comfort her immediately, since letting her sit with the weight of what had happened mattered more than easing her pain in that instant. And this restraint kept the story from collapsing into an easy, instant forgiveness. Sloan finally asked why he had never told her the truth himself, and Nolan admitted that he had considered it more than once. But he wanted to know whether she could love the man before she ever saw the size of what he owned. He told her he never needed her to love a company owner, only hoped she would not have looked down on the man who once stood beside her when Whitmore Dynamics was nearly finished. That single sentence struck harder than anything else said that night, forcing Sloan to remember every overnight repair he completed without complaint, every bonus he refused, every worker he defended in front of a hostile board, evidence that the only dishonest people in her life had never been Nolan at all, but the Whitmores surrounding her. Sterling burst into the room and demanded that his daughter stand with the family, accusing Nolan of stealing the Whitmore legacy out from under them. But for the first time in her life, Sloan refused to obey her father without question. She asked him directly about the signature on the old agreement, and his silence in response answered the question more completely than any denial ever could. Nolan informed Sterling that he would be removed from every advisory role in the company, that Grant would face a full internal investigation, and that the Harrington merger was canceled immediately, though he made clear he had no interest in destroying Whitmore Dynamics itself, since thousands of innocent employees depended on it for their livelihoods. When Sloan asked what he intended to do with her specifically, Nolan answered that it depended entirely on whether she wanted to remain the leader of a family name, or whether she wanted to become someone genuinely worthy of leading a real company. Sloan looked down at the ring resting once again in his hand, wanting badly to ask for it back, yet unable to find the courage to say the words. The following morning brought an emergency meeting of the full board, and this time Nolan entered not as a humiliated guest, but as the controlling shareholder of record. Executives who had dismissed him the night before now rose respectfully as he walked in, and though he showed no trace of satisfaction at the reversal, every sentence he spoke carried unmistakable weight. Mara Ellison announced 3 immediate decisions on his behalf: canceling the merger with Harrington Capital entirely, suspending Grant Whitmore from the board pending investigation, and launching an independent audit into the decades of use surrounding the Avery patents and the convertible debt the company had once quietly sold off. Sterling objected furiously, insisting that Nolan understood nothing of Whitmore culture and lacked the standing to lead a corporation of this size. Nolan responded calmly that it was precisely that kind of standing which had nearly gotten the company sold out from under its own employees. Pierce Harrington arrived with a team of attorneys threatening legal action, only to find that Nolan had already prepared a penalty clause covering any attempt by Harrington Capital to exploit confidential information supplied by Grant, transforming Pierce from a predator circling a wounded company into a man suddenly facing significant legal exposure of his own. The audit itself uncovered far more than anyone in the room had expected, revealing that the royalty payments owed under the original Avery agreement had not simply been reduced, but had been rerouted for years through a series of internal accounts labeled as research overhead, a paper trail that led directly back to decisions Sterling had personally signed off on during his years as chairman. Mara walked the board through spreadsheet after spreadsheet, showing how the company had saved enormous sums by quietly starving the very agreement that had once saved it from collapse. Several board members who had said nothing throughout the meeting shifted visibly in their seats, realizing for the first time exactly how deep the decision ran beneath the polished surface of Whitmore Dynamics. Pierce's attorneys attempted one final maneuver, arguing that any penalty clause tied to Grant's leaked information could not apply retroactively. But Mara produced a signed non-disclosure agreement from years earlier that Pierce himself had agreed to before any merger conversations began, closing that loophole before it could be exploited. Watching his own legal team fall silent, Pierce finally understood that the deal he had assumed was already won had slipped entirely out of his hands, and that continuing to fight in that room would only expose Harrington Capital to greater liability than it could absorb quietly. Sloan sat quietly through the first half of the meeting while the room waited to see whether she would side with her father or with Nolan. Eventually, she rose to her feet and admitted openly that she had allowed emotion, family pressure, and fear of losing her position to cloud her judgment for far too long. She did not beg Nolan to let her keep her title, telling the board instead that if he believed she was no longer fit to lead, she would resign without protest, marking the first moment in the entire ordeal where she placed responsibility above pride. Nolan studied her for a long moment before announcing an unexpected decision, allowing Sloan to remain chief executive for a 90-day probationary period under the oversight of a restructured board, on the condition that she personally disclose the full truth to every employee, apologize publicly for her family's misconduct, and commit to restoring what had been taken from the engineers and workers harmed along the way. Sterling raged that this arrangement humiliated the Whitmore name, and Nolan answered simply that humiliation was calling other people beneath you while living off the fruits of their labor. The room fell silent, and it was clear in that silence that Nolan had won not merely through money, but through preparation, patience, and the plain force of the truth. Sloan called a company-wide meeting soon afterward, choosing to speak in her own words, rather than hide behind a polished statement written for her. She admitted that Whitmore Dynamics had used the Avery technology for years without proper transparency, and she admitted that the board had concealed the truth while nearly trading away the company's soul through the Harrington deal. Employees reacted with initial shock, but many gradually came to respect her honesty, while Nolan stood quietly at the back of the room, refusing the spotlight and letting Sloan face her own people alone. She announced a compensation fund for engineers whose contributions had been stripped from them over the years, a job protection fund for factory workers, and a full restructuring of the board's oversight powers. This did not erase her fall from public grace entirely, but it began to transform her image from a proud executive who had been publicly exposed into a leader willing to accept accountability. In the weeks that followed, Sloan made a habit of walking the factory floors herself, rather than relying on quarterly reports handed to her by middle management, something she had never bothered to do before the scandal forced her to reconsider what leadership actually required. She learned the names of engineers who had spent decades keeping the plant running without ever being thanked publicly, and she began quietly restoring credit lines and patent acknowledgments that had been stripped away long before she ever took the company's top position. Several longtime employees admitted privately that they had expected her to disappear behind lawyers and public relations teams the way her father always had, and her willingness to show up in person slowly began repairing a trust that no press release could have manufactured on its own. The financial markets reacted with more patience than anyone at Whitmore Dynamics expected, largely because the transparency of the audit reassured investors that the worst had already been disclosed rather than hidden away for a future scandal. Analysts who had once treated the Harrington merger as inevitable now pointed to the canceled deal as evidence that the company was finally being run with real oversight rather than family instinct, and the stock, after an initial dip, began a slow and steady recovery built on substance rather than image. Sloan understood that this early goodwill was fragile, and she treated every decision in those 90 days as though the entire recovery depended on it, because in many ways it did. After the meeting ended, Sloan found Nolan at the old engineering workshop inside the plant, the same place where they had first worked side by side, repairing the failing cooling system months earlier. There were no photographers this time, no champagne, no Pierce or Sterling standing nearby to judge them. Sloan apologized, not because Nolan turned out to be wealthy, and not because he now controlled her company, but because she had failed to trust him back when he held no power in her eyes at all. Nolan listened without rushing to forgive her, telling her plainly that the ring was not something she could return one evening and simply reclaim the moment the truth came out in her favor. Sloan understood, and rather than ask for the ring back outright, she only asked whether there might still be a chance to make things right between them, to which Nolan replied that she had a genuine chance to repair the company, and that whatever remained between the two of them would simply have to be answered by time. Grant attempted to escape accountability by leaking a false story claiming Nolan had seized Whitmore Dynamics purely out of personal spite, hiring outlets to paint him as an ambitious single father exploiting a romantic connection to seize control of a major corporation. Nolan did not respond with scandal of his own, choosing instead to let the documents speak, and Mara released the chain of emails, the private commission agreement, and the financial incentives Grant had been promised in exchange for pushing the Harrington deal through. Public sentiment shifted rapidly once the paperwork became visible to everyone. Pierce attempted to preserve his reputation by insisting that Harrington Capital had no knowledge of any internal wrongdoing. But Nolan supplied further evidence showing his team had already prepared to break Whitmore Dynamics apart, sell off its manufacturing divisions, and retain only the patents for resale. Shareholders within Harrington's own firm applied enough pressure that Pierce was quietly removed from any role overseeing the deal. Sterling lost his influence within the company he had spent his life protecting, and while the story avoided turning him into an exaggerated villain, he was punished in the way he feared most, losing his voice inside the very empire that carried his family name. For years, Sterling had measured his own worth entirely by the reach of his authority inside Whitmore Dynamics, treating every board seat, every signature, and every closed-door meeting as proof that the family name still commanded respect. Watching that authority dissolve in a matter of weeks forced him into a kind of reckoning he had spent his entire life avoiding. And though he never fully admitted wrongdoing in front of the board, those closest to him noticed a change in his posture. A man suddenly aware that respect earned through fear could vanish far faster than respect earned through decades of honest work. He retreated from public appearances almost entirely, spending most of his time at a house upstate, no longer the commanding presence who once decided who belonged in a room and who did not. Pierce Harrington fared little better in the aftermath, as investors within his own firm grew increasingly uneasy about a deal that had nearly dragged Harrington Capital into a public scandal involving stolen intellectual property and leaked corporate information. Rather than risk further damage to the fund's reputation, the firm's senior partners quietly reassigned Pierce away from any future acquisitions involving manufacturing or engineering firms, a professional demotion disguised as a lateral move that everyone in that world understood for what it truly was. The engagement he had once treated as a guaranteed conquest, both romantic and financial, became instead a cautionary story whispered about in rival firms for years afterward. Grant himself tried one last appeal before the vote, standing before the very board he had once manipulated with confidence, insisting that his actions had only ever been meant to protect the family from an outsider circling their fortune. Nobody in the room believed him, least of all Sloan, who had spent enough sleepless nights replaying every conversation with her cousin to recognize exactly how long his manipulation had been running beneath the surface of their relationship. It was Sloan herself who signed the order removing Grant from the board, a decision that proved she had finally chosen the truth and the company over blind loyalty to her family. Nolan largely stayed out of that process, allowing Sloan to prove through her own actions that real change was possible, which kept the story grounded, rather than turning him into a simple rescuer who fixed everything without effort on her part. As Grant was escorted out of his private office for the final time, he passed Nolan in the hallway and bitterly remarked that a repairman would never truly belong among the Whitmores, to which Nolan answered only that starting that day, Whitmore would have to learn how to belong to the people who actually built it. 3 months later, Whitmore Dynamics had begun a genuine recovery. Sloan completed her 90-day probationary period, publicly released the full audit findings, finished the compensation program for the affected engineers, and managed to preserve every major manufacturing plant under her leadership. Employees who had once doubted her slowly began to trust her again, watching her decisions rather than her family name for the first time in years. Nolan remained the controlling shareholder, but stepped back from daily operations entirely, returning to his workshop at Avery Precision Repair and resuming the quiet life he preferred. His daughter appeared only briefly in this closing chapter, a small reminder that family and peace still mattered to him far more than status or attention ever could. Sloan eventually visited the workshop without an entourage, without a luxury vehicle waiting outside, carrying only a single envelope containing her formal resignation as chief executive. She told Nolan that if her presence only reminded him of the betrayal at the Gala, she would step away entirely rather than force him to see her every day. Nolan read the letter and tore it in half, telling her that Whitmore did not need someone who abandoned the effort halfway through making things right, and that the company needed a leader who had actually learned the price of pride. Sloan placed the ring on the table between them, and rather than asking for it back this time, she set beside it a small handwritten pledge promising she would never again judge a person's worth by reputation, family name, or power. Nolan lifted the ring slowly, and rather than proposing again in that instant, he simply handed it back to her, telling her that this time she did not need to wear it because he owned her company, Only if she truly understood why he had given it to her in the first place, back when he had nothing in her eyes at all. Sloane's eyes filled quietly, without collapsing into despair, and she placed the ring on her own finger, not as an easy victory for love, but as the beginning of something rebuilt on genuine respect rather than convenience. The final scene unfolded during the company's new annual shareholder meeting, held without the extravagant gala theatrics of the past, on a modest stage facing employees, engineers, factory workers, and smaller shareholders rather than a room full of performative elite guests. Sloan told the gathered crowd that Whitmore Dynamics had been built on the family name, but had only survived because of a truth her own family once tried desperately to bury. She introduced Nolan not as the man who now owned her company, but as the man who had returned the company to its rightful values. Nolan spoke only briefly when he took the stage, announcing that a portion of the shares would be transferred into a new innovation fund reserved for young engineers and factory workers with practical inventions of their own. He explained that this was not an attempt to polish his own name, but a way to ensure no one would ever be stripped of credit the way his father once had been. Sloan looked at him without a trace of embarrassment at his presence beside her, feeling something closer to genuine pride than she had expected. A reporter in the crowd asked Nolan how it felt to move from being publicly humiliated with a returned ring to becoming the man who controlled all of Whitmore Dynamics. Nolan glanced at the ring resting on Sloan's hand before answering that he never needed to reclaim his dignity by destroying her, only needed the truth to finally stand in its rightful place. Sterling watched the ceremony from the back of the room, no longer seated among the executives but standing quietly with the ordinary shareholders, a position he would have once considered beneath him. He said nothing as his daughter spoke, and for the first time in years his silence carried something closer to humility than pride, though whether that humility would last beyond the afternoon remained an open question that even Sloan chose not to press. Grant did not attend at all, having accepted a quiet settlement that kept his name out of criminal proceedings in exchange for surrendering every share he still held, a fitting end for a man who had always valued a commission over a conscience. June Avery sat near the front that afternoon, old enough now to understand at least the outline of what her father had endured to protect a legacy she would one day inherit herself. Nolan caught her eye briefly before stepping off the stage, and in that small exchange lay the entire reason he had spent years gathering documents in silence rather than seeking a courtroom battle he might have won years earlier, choosing instead to wait until the moment was right rather than the moment was easy. He had never wanted to be known as the man who destroyed Whitmore Dynamics, only as the man who made sure it could never again forget who had built it. Sloan, walking beside him through the crowd afterward, reflected quietly on how differently this ending had unfolded compared to everything her father had once promised her about power, marriage, and legacy. She had believed for most of her life that strength meant never showing doubt and never admitting fault. Yet the months since the gala had taught her that real strength lived in the willingness to stand in front of people who trusted you and tell them the truth even when it cost you everything you thought defined you. It was a lesson she suspected she would spend the rest of her career relearning in smaller ways, long after the cameras and the headlines had moved on to some other story entirely. The story closed with Nolan and Sloan walking off the stage together, not as a perfect fairy tale ending stitched together overnight, but as two people who understood that love could return only after trust had been rebuilt through action rather than words alone.